My name is Bheki Mahlobo, and I welcome you to the latest CRA briefing. I work as an analyst at the Center for Risk Analysis, and welcome to the briefing called the ANC's Corruption Dilemma. The reason why we have essentially come up with this whole briefing is to essentially answer the question as to will the ANC solve its corruption dilemma, and what is some of the noise that we see from the ANC, and what does it mean for the country as well as for the ANC? Frans will speak for 20 minutes, and then I will later on facilitate the Q&A. I will now hand on to Frans that will handle the briefing.
Sure, Bheki, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm Frans Cronje. I direct the Center for Risk Analysis. I'm doing the talking this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes or so. And what I'm going to try and do is set out some of the hard measures and indicators around whether the ANC can address its own and the South African government's corruption problem. When I'm done, Bheki will facilitate some questions. You should be following me on the screen. You should see a big red screen, says the ANC's Corruption Dilemma, Center for Risk Analysis, etc. If you're not seeing that for some reason, talk to one of the organizers and they will help you out. I was struck by this when we first started facing client queries about whether the corruption demon could eventually be slayed. I was struck very much by this quote. And it reads, "The ANC is pained immensely by stories of corruption. We are highly conscious of the damage that it does to the party and the country. With some cases, we may have made an approach that's too legalistic and an approach that needs to be reassessed." And if you guess who said that, you're right. That is Cyril Ramaphosa, but it's not from his letter 2 weeks ago. It's a statement he made in October of 1996, almost a quarter of a century ago. And the fact that he has been wrestling with this demon for that amount of time, I think sets properly the tone for what is going to be a fairly skeptical briefing, I must warn you, this afternoon. The order of things for this afternoon, there are 8 things. We're going to look at some estimates about corruption within ANC ranks first. Then we're going to start to look at the climate that allows corruption to thrive. We're going to look at audit outcomes for municipalities. We're going to look at those same municipalities on a provincial basis. Do some provinces do better than others? We're going to look at broader government audit outcomes for government departments and national departments and government parastatals and the like. We're going to look into some Auditor General reports and some estimates that the Auditor General has come up with about the extent of malfeasance in government spending. I'm going to show you some comments about the Treasury, which I think are very important. We're then going to go to what the ANC in fact resolved at its NEC meeting 2 weeks ago. We have the draft minutes of that meeting. We'll quote from those. We'll tell you our conclusions, and then we'll take your questions. Let's start with the question of the extent of corruption within ANC leadership ranks. Now, we conducted an exercise here. We took the ordinary members of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and there are 80 such members. And we researched and analyzed them to see had any been implicated in acts of serious corruption. And I was asked a while back when we first started sharing this data with some clients, what do we define as serious corruption? And I said anything that would trigger a mandatory 15-year prison sentence. Now, the outcome of that analysis was as follows. 41 of the 80 members of the NEC were implicated in allegations of serious corruption. 8 were definitely not implicated at all. We're unable to make a call on the balance of the 31. And I think the first point that leaps out here at one I'll emphasize throughout the afternoon, is the scale of the rot that has been allowed to creep into that party and the government that it leads over, certainly over the last decade. And given that scale, the great difficulty that anybody would now have in cleaning up the institution. From there, let's go to audit outcomes and get a feel for what the sort of climate of financial management around the state is, because if standards are very high or audit outcomes very excellent, the room for malfeasance would be limited. If the standards are not what they should be, that creates a lot of scope for corruption. Now, municipalities that are audited can end up in one of three categories. They can get an unqualified audit. Everything is exactly the way it should be. The financial statements are free from material misstatements. There are no material findings. Everything is, this is a kind of audit outcome that any serious institution would, as a matter of course, insist on having. It would remove its management team if anything else was delivered. Second outcome is an unqualified audit. So the statements do not contain material misstatements, but there are problems. Findings have been raised about reporting on objectives, compliance with legislation, not necessarily corruption, but not everything is the way it should be. And then there's a third category that we called others. And this ranges from adverse audit opinions to disclaimers. And here there are very serious problems. And the auditors are unable to properly assess that the statements reflect the state of the finances of the institution in question. Three categories. Now, the chart you're looking at runs from 2013-14 financial year to 2018-19. It's the municipal audit outcomes. It's all municipalities in the country over that 5-year period, whether the audits were unqualified in green. These are the good audits, the excellent audits. And here there's a problem. At best, 2015-16 showed 20% of municipalities recording unqualified audit opinions. And that performance has weakened in the subsequent period. Unqualified with findings, so the statements are accurate, but there are some problems. About 40% of audits average the figure across the board. And then others, these are the adverse opinions and the disclaimers. And this is an alarming problem because approximately half, even more than that, of municipalities audited in South Africa are securing such opinions, and that is a position that is worsened over time. Stay with the municipal data, but look at it on a provincial basis, and something quite interesting begins to leap out at one. In the Eastern Cape, now these are municipal audit outcomes in the Eastern Cape, very low proportion of unqualified audits. About 40% of audits are qualified with findings, but the most recent data we have 6 out of 10 are disclaimers, adverse opinions, and the like. Go to the Free State, and the position, amazingly, is even worse, with no unqualified opinions. Almost 90% of municipalities falling into our red category of others. Gauteng, the position is much better. So the point that leaps out here at one is that there are strong differences between provinces in the quality of their audit outcomes. Only 9% are unqualified without findings, but the great majority of audits in Gauteng, about 80%, the latest figures, are unqualified without or unqualified with findings, which is the beginning of starting to get it right. Only 20% fall into the other category. KwaZulu-Natal's position differs again. About 40% fall into that very dangerous red category. The position in Limpopo is very bad. About 3/4 are falling into the red category of audits, and a trend line that's been worsening in recent years. The same regrettably true of Mpumalanga, seen sharp worsening in the quality of its audit outcomes when it comes to Mpumalanga's municipalities. Northwest is quite staggering. The number 100% of audits are disclaimed. And we know there's been a lot of internal contestation within the political leadership ranks of that province. The Northern Cape, a very poor performance again, at around 71%. The Western Cape, a much stronger performance, although the unqualified position has worsened. Only 10% are others, disclaimers and the like. About over 90% of the Western Cape's audits are unqualified in one form or another, following similar to the position, slightly better than that in Gauteng. And the point here for me was scale again. You saw our figures on the extent of corruption implications of people implicated in the National Executive Committee of the ANC. Now you see the extent to which municipalities are open to potential corruption and malfeasance. And this is not this is becoming an institutionalized problem in how public finances are managed and the caliber of the political leaders that manage those finances. Let's go to broader government audit outcomes and have a look at what's happening there. Now, these are public entities. So these would be parastatals and then national government departments. The data runs from 2013 to 2018, 2019, and the same three categories: unqualified, unqualified with findings, and other. Now, the position is in some respects better than in many municipalities, but only a quarter of audit opinions are unqualified without findings. A significant proportion, about half, have on average been unqualified with findings, but even at a national government level, you'd expect a higher degree of political scrutiny, given the importance of national government. About a quarter, third of audit opinions in South Africa remain in the very problematic red, disclaimers, etc. category. Go to the provincial outcomes for provinces themselves. The previous data I showed you was how municipalities and provinces perform. This is now how provinces themselves perform. The data is only on unqualified audit outcomes. This is unqualified without findings. So this is the best category, what was previously the green category. We show you the data for 2 financial years, 2017 and 2018. And the picture is not good across the board. The Western Cape stands out as a relative beacon of fiduciary responsibility. Gauteng performs, this is 2017-18, much better than the average, but still not terribly good. And in the Free State, well, that was the stomping ground of Ace Magashule. And you can see the extent of the problem there. 2018-19, the picture is somewhat mixed, and regrettably, the position in Gauteng has deteriorated somewhat. It's improved a little bit in KwaZulu-Natal, but these things are neither here nor there. The takeout again is the scale at which problematic audit outcomes have become a feature institutionalized around the management of public funds in South Africa. Now let's quickly go to some Auditor General numbers and estimates on the extent of which expenditure is incurred in an incorrect manner. Now, the Auditor General audits and acts under 2 pieces of legislation in the main. It's a Public Finance Management Act, and that regulates the spending of national and provincial government. And then there's the Municipal Finance Management Act that applies the same thing to municipalities and their entities to ensure that a revenue expenditure taxpayer money is managed efficiently and effectively. Now, when the Auditor General does its work, it comes up with 3 categories of analysis where there is a problem in how funds have been spent. The one category the Auditor General uses is unauthorized expenditure, and it finds here that the entity in question has incurred the expenditure without provision for it having been made in its budget, without it being properly approved. Then there's irregular expenditure, which has occurred in a manner contrary to that prescribed by legislation. So somewhere in the course of things, the entity incurring the expense hasn't complied with applicable legislation. And then there's fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Expenditure in vain, it might have been avoided, the goods were never delivered, etc. Now, these three categories do not necessarily impute corruption. It could simply be poor financial management, a poor general management. The point I make, and the reason I am going to show you this data, similar to what I showed you on the audit outcomes before, it speaks to the extent to which a climate exists in which malfeasance, including corruption, could thrive. Now, here's some numbers. 2016-17 financial year into 2018-19, unauthorized expenditure. The Municipal Finance Management Act will be in red, and then the Public Finance Management Act will be in orange. And the amounts are, we can debate in the greater scheme of things. The state this year tends to spend 1.8 trillion rand. This is a 10 or 12 billion rand. But watch what happens when we start to add these numbers up. Now, this is the unauthorized component of expenditure identified by the Auditor General. Under the Public Finance Management Act, the numbers far more modest in relation to what we see under the MFMA. Move on to irregular expenditure, expenditure incurred at odds with legislation. Figures are somewhat higher under the MFMA. Under the Public Finance Management Act, they roughly double what we see under the MFMA, and in 2018-19, about 50 billion rand so flagged by the Auditor General. Thirdly, fruitless and wasteful expenditure. Under the MFMA, it seems quite modest amounts, almost just on 2 billion rand in 2018. Also, seemingly modest amounts under the PFMA. But what Bheki did as he wrote this briefing is he added these together and then compared them, I think, appropriately to the police's budget. Now, according to Bheki's calculations, the total quantum of unauthorized, irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure in 2016-17 was about 90 billion rand, was about 120 billion. The subsequent year, it's back to 90 billion now. Let's say it averages around 100 billion rand a year. Now, I said to you earlier that the state this year intends to spend about 1.8 trillion rand. The great 60% of that will be on salaries, meaning that the government's budget, procurement budget beyond salaries, sits at a level of about 700 or 800 billion rand. So these figures flagged here by the Auditor General come in at about 15% of government procurement expenditure according to our calculations. From here, I want to take you to some comments out of the Treasury, which are important because they suggest that the impression I might just have created for you, that about 10 to 15% of expenditure is attached to malfeasance, and might be understating the problem. Kenneth Brown was the former Chief Procurement Officer at the Treasury, and in October 2016, he suggested that as much as 30 to 40% of the government's then 600 billion goods and services budget, that's the same budget I referred to earlier, it's now of course slightly higher, is consumed by inflated prices by suppliers and by fraud. Now here, I'm going to make a point for you later, but just let it stew in your mind for a second. Inflated prices and fraud are separate issues, and the media in South Africa tends to conflate them collectively into corruption. But we're going to get there in a second. The point of Brown's comment is that our figures at 10, 15% might understate the extent of the problem, particularly where the question of inflated prices is introduced. Now, his successor, Willie Matabula, in August 2018, this is testimony, I think, to the Zondo Commission. I might be incorrect, but I'm certain it is. You would find instances where contract starts at 4 million, but time you know it, the contract value is sitting at 200 million. And you ask yourself, how is it possible? The other question to ask yourself is, in South Africa, I mean, it's obscene, and it's morally corrupt, but would it qualify as corruption in South Africa, given the preferential procurement policy ambitions, policies of the government's question I'm going to return for you to in a brief moment. Before that, the ANC's NEC minutes. Now, we obtained a draft copy of the minutes of that meeting. I stress it's a draft, but they are what they are. And there's a paragraph there that struck us. And it reads as follows, that the party, it said, it resolved that those accused of corruption and other serious crimes, including those charged in courts, may be expected to step aside from their positions and responsibilities. Now, the word may has been emphasized there by my colleagues. It's open to interpretation, but it suggests something different to the tenor of a lot of the media reporting on corruption in recent weeks over the past month, that those so implicated would be expected to step aside from their responsibilities. It leaves open a little escape hatch. As I read those minutes, and I think my colleagues had the same sense, some themes stood out, and the theme was the recognition of the political damage that allegations of corruption, particularly around the COVID procurement corruption, was doing to the ANC, and that something had to be done to demonstrate to the public that the ANC appreciated their anger and frustration and would do something about it. Here's a quote. The NEC believes that these and other actions, to be led by national officials, must show a clear paradigm shift, a sign of determination to build an ethical and people-centered movement to lead the process of social transformation. Now, you're just seeing little windows into this. If you read the whole, you do get the feeling that the public relations behind this is emphasized particularly strongly, perhaps even more strongly in our reading than the need to do something substantive about it. The minutes went on to quote Mr. Ramaphosa, "The people must see that we are deeply concerned and ashamed at what has happened, and that the name of the ANC has been tarnished." And I think that has been achieved in the tenor of a lot of the media reporting, but it's a positive move, I'm sure, but it's a step removed from the firm action that the public will later and inevitably demand. What are our conclusions? And remember, we are risk analysts. That's what we do. We flag risks so that nothing happens on the downside or on the upside. That we try and remove uncertainty from a client. Nothing must happen that takes you by surprise. That's our purpose. If you are surprised by something, we failed. Now, our conclusions are the following. The scale of corruption has become institutionalized. A comment from a colleague I drew into these conclusions, nearly woven into the fabric of both the ANC and the government. Now that's going to make, that is the price of the last decade of Mr. Zuma. It does make Mr. Ramaphosa's efforts far more difficult than a lot of media analysis suggests. This is not just a case of removing a few rotten eggs. This is a whole different kettle of fish. We also see in our analysis that the corruption is cross-factional. The idea that there's a clean ANC fighting a dirty ANC and that these are neat and tidy factions, one aligned to reformers and one aligned to something else, it doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny. And that many of those implicated in acts of corruption find themselves on what is publicly regarded as the better side of the party. And this will complicate ANC efforts to address the problem, because if the sincere efforts at prosecution are pursued, if cases go to court, many of those implicated will not go quietly, and many of those implicated will sit on the very side of the party that is making some attempt, nominally at least, to address the question of corruption. It also appears to us that if prosecutors are given a green light, political space to prosecute without fear and favor, the consequences could be to devastate the management ranks of the African National Congress. But such a move would first have to be agreed to within those ranks. And that's the great catch-22 here, that the people who may very well fall victim to the prosecutions end up in prison and lose their jobs and titles. Very often people who will have some say and influence about whether those prosecutions proceed at all. And even if you can get past that problem and do the prosecutions, what is the consequences for the party itself, given the extent to which the rot has been internalized through the era of Mr. Zuma? We also flag the risk that if sincere action at scale, and I think that's the critical thing here, not to fall for the idea that a few test cases are prosecuted, expendable mid-level operators who of little political consequence for the party. If sincere action is taken to clean up the leakage of funding out of the fiscus, that would undermine the patronage networks upon which ANC unity depends. Now, any political movement has to be held together by something. It can be held together by a great historical quest, such as the defeat of apartheid. It can be held together by an ideology, by an objective. It can also be held together by access to cash. And to some extent, I think it is true within some of the ranks of the ANC that there is a sense that if you're loyal to the party, you don't cause trouble, you don't jockey for position. Your loyal cadre, you will be rewarded with access to cash through the state in one form or another. It might be a low level, a job in a municipality. It might be at a pretty high level, a tender or contract, something of that nature. Cut that off and you remove a lot of the glue that holds this very fractured and fractious movement together. Consequences of that, I'm not sure if the ANC could survive. A further conclusion we stumbled upon is the point I made to you earlier around Kenneth Brown's comments, that there's fraud on the one hand and there's inflated prices on the other. Now, a lot of the leakage, I think, plays out through inflated prices. The media, however, let me read the bullet to you. The preferential procurement policy has legal legitimacy. It is legally legitimate to be a middleman, to win a tender, to supply a good or a service to the state at a markup. Now, sometimes the markups are obscene. The principle remains the same. This has legal legitimacy, but it does in practice come down to the same rent seeking that the media and the public increasingly regard as corruption. So the media comes across a story of a good being supplied at a high markup. They describe that as corruption. But challenging that rent seeking would in effect put empowerment policy in South Africa on trial, and politically the country's not ready for that yet. And I think that's a backstop that will further complicate efforts to clean up the institutional rot. My sense ultimately, and I think shared by the bulk of my colleagues, is that the government appreciates, Mr. Ramaphosa certainly, that they are pressed to act. They must be seen to act because the political damage that would otherwise ensue, the political damage already ensuing is so very great. But they're trapped, and this is the dilemma, the title of this briefing, that sincere attempts to deal with corruption might end up tearing the ANC apart. And before I go back to Bheki, we'll deal with his questions. We slotted this quote in, struck us when it was made, I think in 2018. I would rather be seen as a weak president than to split the ANC. So that's not my mission. My mission is to keep the ANC united. And I think as long as that remains a priority in Mr. Ramaphosa's mind and within the broader alliance, it'll be very difficult to act effectively and firmly against corruption. Before Bheki takes over, Bheki, give me 1 minute. If you are not familiar with everything that we do, we would like to change that. We do a lot of notes and things. Monday mornings, very popular. There's a podcast Bheki and I do 7 a.m. Under 10 minutes on every major global and South African risk. We do a number of briefings, both bespoke briefings for clients, and then more generic webinars such as this one this afternoon. We provide a lot of advice to firms and individuals who are making decisions about South Africa. They can test their decisions against some of our reads and understanding. And if you are not already engaged with us, either at an institutional level or as an individual subscriber, we would very much like to change that. Broader picture on South Africa from us, there's an easy way to get into that. It's a book my colleagues and I published at the peak of the pandemic, Rise and Fall. Kindle edition is on Amazon. Real books are in exclusive books. I end for you there. I hand back to Bheki to take us through the questions. Bheki, I'm in your hands.
Thank you so much, Frans, for that extraordinary, insightful briefing. I just want to remind the attendees that if you'd like to ask us questions, you have options available to you. You can either post your questions in the Q&A section or the chat section, or if you'd like to ask us a question using your mic, please raise your hand and I will unmute your mic. So Frans, we already have 2 questions. The first question comes from Leroy. Are we asking Ramaphosa to fight the same system that made him a billionaire?
I don't think it's as clear-cut as that. I think in the early year, I mean, Mr. Ramaphosa did terribly well out of South Africa's empowerment policies. And that's a matter that I think will finally be settled in the historical record, the moral rights and wrongs of it. But certainly in the early years when empowerment policy was devised, the intent was to create avenues out of poverty, the nominal intent, create avenues out of poverty for people who had suffered so terribly at the hands of the former regime. And what has come of that is it's created a monster of sorts that has been able to conceal and facilitate corruption that's now reached an institutional level. Where Leroy's question has some legs is that Mr. Ramaphosa was one of the architects of empowerment policy, which would include preferential procurement policy, where such a degree of leakage and malfeasance now occurs. So yes, that would probably be a historical, I mean, a personal challenge for him to fight. But the broader theme of the question, I think, that institutions that facilitate corruption need to be challenged and dismantled, and that would include legislation and policy. That I agree with completely. The idea that you can just prosecute X, Y, and Z, and then we're in the clear, or lock up the Guptas, and then we're in the clear. Our analysis suggests that the problem is far greater and more deep and deeper than that. Bheki, back to you.
So we also have a question from Leroy. Why does Ramaphosa keep saying, I'm shocked? Does he not know what's happening, or is he trying to fool us?
I wouldn't ascribe that to him. I think it is shocking. I mean, we're quite hard-nosed analysts, and we've got a hawkish reputation that we guard jealously. But I mean, Bheki, you know, when we were putting these charts together, when we saw some of the municipal audit outcomes, like for Northwest, I was shocked. You know, you're in a province that's got 100% disclaimers and adverse audit opinions. I think it is shocking. If you'd labored under the delusion that sincere efforts at reform were taking place within Eskom, yeah, now Mr. Ramaphosa should be in a position where he's less shocked. But it is frightening to think. If you consider where South Africa was at the end of 2007, budget surplus, economic growth rate of 5%, we doubled the number of people in employment. Fixed investment to GDP levels, gross fixed capital formation had rocketed away. Translated to now, I think it is shocking, although his PR people should probably get him to say that a little bit less. But even for me, you know, and I've seen quite a lot. Some of the data that was put into this briefing for me to present to you, I thought, wow, you know, not amazed, but the institutional depth of the corruption problem is not properly understood. Bheki, what's next?
So Emily would like us to go to the conclusion slide. I'd just like to remind all attendees that you will have access to the slides. Sherwin will send everyone on this call the slides so that you can have a look. On the chat option, we have a question from Herman. Do you have a thumbs-up view on the percentage probability that A, Ramaphosa can succeed largely in rooting out corruption, and if so, B, that the ANC will fall apart within the next 10 years or so?
I think this is the dilemma, you know, to root it out. If the ANC does not firmly, does not at the level of the institution of the ANC root out corruption, that will simply accelerate its electoral demise. And if you've attended previous webinars with me or my colleagues, we've shown you a lot of the data on ANC support levels and trends, and you know that we think that the party is vulnerable to defeat nationally in 2024. And corruption, the narrative around corruption has certainly bolstered that analysis. So if he fails to act, I think it's a slow decline. If you take very firm action, though, and you devastate your management ranks, you cripple the party in infighting, you remove that patronage glue that holds it together, it's not guaranteed the ANC survives either way. And people speak of tipping points on things. What has corruption reached an ANC tipping point? And did that happen a number of years ago? And I think if you go back to, if it did, that would be the vote in Parliament on dissolving the Scorpions. Happened more than a decade ago. We're now seeing the consequences of some of that. But it would take a ruthless political effort now to, at once, firmly act on corruption, remove corrupt elements, and hold the ruling alliance together. It would be a heroic political effort. Doable at a stretch. I don't think it's going to happen. Bheki, did someone ask me to put up the last slide, Bheki?
Yes, the conclusion slide, sir.
Okay, let me just think about how to do that. Ask me a question. I'm going to puzzle my way into this. Right.
The next question comes from Nick. Is it clear that corruption is deeply entrenched within the ANC to the extent that properly taking on corruption back in the ANC's post-1994 history, does this corruption go? Is it simply a hangover over the Zuma era, or does the roots go all the way back to Mandela or Bheki era?
Yeah, Bheki, are you seeing my conclusion slide?
Yes, I can see them, sir.
Okay. Obviously, the roots go back further. I think the arms deal corruption is very important. And the inability, perhaps unwillingness of the Bheki administration to properly take it to task. That certainly set the scene for what would happen in the era of Jacob Zuma. I think that's a part of it. I think a second part of it, and here the distinction between corruption and perhaps what malfeasance, what the media interprets as corruption, becomes important again. I think in an environment where a degree of corruption was initially tolerated and later got wholly out of control, you multiply that by the preferential procurement policies of government and their initial institutional legitimacy. And that is how you get to the point that we find ourselves at today. So yes, I'd certainly take it back into the Bheki era. That set the scene. But of course, it was taken to these incredible levels in the era of Mr. Zuma. Mr. Ramaphosa inherits this mess. Well, of course, he was party to the Zuma administration as the deputy president for a number of years. And for the reasons I've set out for you, the depth of it and the consequences for the stability of the ANC, he finds it very difficult to act firmly. Bheki, what's next?
We have another question from Mike. Political interference has obstructed prosecutorial will for a long time. Are you satisfied that this is being addressed with a sense of urgency?
I don't think so, no. I mean, I don't think what we'd be satisfied with is one thing. What does the evidence show is another. Now, you know, one becomes aware of the allegations made against some key leaders. You speak perhaps to some law enforcement types, and from that, I fail to understand how a raft of prosecutions are not already in train. It cannot be for an absence of evidence. So where's the blockage in the prosecutorial system? Is there, there has to be a blockage. There's not a shortage of evidence. You don't have to find every piece of evidence on the individual you wish to prosecute. You just find the thing that will have him convicted and he gets his mandatory prison sentence, and away you go. There's a blockage in the system. Where it rests, very difficult to say, but it must be political in nature. And I think the smoking gun of sorts was this. Well, I think it's a theme that observers of South Africa will see play out over the next year, is making it seem that very firm action on corruption is being taken without much by way of action in practice occurring. That's my expectation. And if that is the case, you cannot evade the conclusion that at some level in the political machinery, prosecutors are being held back from doing what would seem so easy, obvious, and logical to do. Bheki.
Our next question comes from Leroy. Will people in rural areas ever get title deeds?
No, well, there are efforts to make title available in rural areas. It's been terribly slow. It should be accelerated. Some private institutions are doing great work there. It's all, of course, contradicted in a sense by moves towards expropriation, which place the entire institution of title in question. But some very slow moves in that direction have been made. We're quite big believers in DeSoto and dead capital, etc. So I think that would be a very positive direction to move into, but it's certainly not occurring at the scale at which it should, Bheki.
Our next question comes from Laurie. Does it mean that only a good regime change can end corruption in South Africa?
Well, I think it's two things. Well, how do you get out of this mess on corruption? You need very ruthless political action in order to pull it off. And I think a strong man leader would be able to, I think it's the sort of thing Mandela would have been able to secure within the ANC. Otherwise you can't get out of the corruption trap ever. And that will forever compromise your ability to grow and draw investment while your political mandate weakens, and as the mandate weakens, your populist, your inclinations to populism, of course, increase. So it takes ruthlessly firm political action on the one hand. The other hand is that what we are seeing in the absence of action is another trend indicative of the possibility of the ANC losing its political majority in South Africa and doing so this decade, which regular users of our work know is something we've been flagging since 2012, formally on the record in 2012. I saw 2024 as the moment where that might happen. So I don't see a third way out of trouble here. Either it's ruthless action inside the political system, or it is the ballot box where the problem is eventually addressed. Now, none of this should amaze anyone. It should come as a particularly insightful, profound analysis. It was, after all, the purpose of South Africa becoming a democracy a quarter of a century ago. that should a point like this be reached, where the view became that the country was not well governed in the best interests of its people, and one of the key pillars of that malfeasance was not efficiently addressed, that South Africans might turn to the ballot box in order to change outcomes. And that remains centerpiece of Centre for Risk Analysis thinking today. Bheki, back to you.
Our next question comes from Nash. The ANC is continuously holding inquiries into the misconduct, criminal offences alleged against its members, and we have seen how those end. These allegations must be investigated by authorities and the ANC, and its structure must accept determinations made by a court. The question is, how do the citizens bring the ANC to heel without storming the Bastilles?
Storming the French Revolution, storming the Bastille. Well, I think through the ballot box, Nash, is the answer. And free societies, that South Africa remains in the main, do not fall victim to violent revolution. They can fall victim to violent anarchic protest action and the like. There's a degree of that in South Africa. They change through the ballot box, and the trends there are clear. If you're a CRA client or user and you haven't seen our earlier briefings or thinking on that, send us a note, we'll send you the data. But I'll give you one insight into that ahead of the election last year, amongst people in their early 20s, ANC support was sitting at just over 50%, and this in a country where only a third of people are over the age of 35. You project that into a future election and you see the consequences. The comment on the numerous inquiries, all good and well, but there's nothing that's been led at the Zondo Commission that couldn't have been led at a criminal trial. And I'm afraid it's my conclusion that many of these inquiries are public relations. They are geared in the main at creating the impression that something is being done, when in practice the issue is being kicked for touch. And in the end, where the rubber hits the road on the corruption problem in South Africa, people in the dock sentenced to mandatory 15-year terms in prison. Short of that, the problem in the country cannot be effectively addressed. Bheki.
Our next question comes from Deval. We saw the Lebanese protests have a result in government officials resigning. How might mass protest action influence something similar in South Africa?
Well, there is mass protest action in South Africa. The number of protest actions and the proportion that are violent have increased sharply over the past decade. We've tracked the number on that. How will they influence the government? Well, they certainly do. I mean, it's this very anger and frustration that causes a statement to be made, such as that we must make it clear to the public that we take this seriously. So there is a political response to it, and it does buy you time for a time. But ultimately, if firm action doesn't follow, on corruption, as is true for economic reform or job creation or whatever else, you can have as many summits as you like. You can pander to public opinion as effectively as your public relations people can possibly do. In the end, if you don't have prosecutions and stop the rot, if you don't actually create jobs and new businesses on the ground, you've played for time, and the political consequences will catch up with you. Bheki.
Before we move on to our next question, Frans, could you please stop sharing your screen? I just want to remind all attendees that you will have access to the screens, to the slides. Sherwin will send them out shortly. Our next question comes from Mike. Just how strong is the fraction opposed to Ramaphosa's leadership? Strong enough to prevail?
Yes, it is strong enough to prevail, opposed to Ramaphosa's leadership. Well, there are two levels of opposition. One is ideological, sits to the left of the party. It's very influential, commands a great deal of the cabinet. It's the sort of faction that gets in the way of the sort of bouts of common sense that emanate from Tito Mboweni. And then so that's on the policy and ideology side. There's a the balance of opinion, I say, is at odds with Mr. Mboweni in both the cabinet and the NEC. Then on the question of governance and corruption, which is a separate problem, there nominally, I mean, even Ace Magashule has made some firm statements about his dismay at the extent of corruption within the government. Nominally, everyone is on board there with Mr. Ramaphosa, as long as his efforts remain in the realm of public relations, inquiries, and posturing. Firm action, I don't think he'd have much support. And here I want to return to the comment I made about this misnomer that there's a battle of good versus bad within the ANC. There's a good faction that's clean, not corrupt, and supports structural reform, and it's clashing with a bad faction that is corrupt and opposes structural reform. In reality, that doesn't work on the ground at all in the ANC. Many of those who are particularly clean sit on the left, within the SACP and the like, often on governance. They're far less enmeshed in malfeasance than some of their peers, but they strongly oppose structural reform. Then there are others on the Ramaphosa side of the equation who support everything he's trying to do, believe the country would be better run if he was successful, but are themselves implicated in allegations of corruption. And if he ever acted firmly, those actions might in time ensnare them, and they could go to prison. So is there, on policy, strong support? I think you distinguish the question of strong support for Mr. Ramaphosa from strong support for structural reform. There's very limited support for structural reform, and that is the reason we don't see much by way of structural reform. The analysis is deceptive in its simplicity. On corruption, nominally there's wide support, but there are very few people who would sleep comfortably knowing that a ruthless and rapacious prosecutor had been given free rein to do what must be done. Bheki.
Our next question comes from Richard. There was mention in the news recently that South Africa could become a failed state by 2030. A large number of my friends have immigrated or are planning to immigrate soon. Is there still hope? Just a note to the clients on this call that this month's macro review will focus on immigration trends. So Frans,
that analysis came out of Claude Bassiak, and Claude is good. So yeah, absolutely. We run scenarios in which South Africa ends effectively as in fact, we use the term in one of our scenario briefings, and one of those scenarios a failed state. There's nothing in South Africa, its place in the world, its people, its history, its people are wonderful, that says that it is so unique that it cannot follow in the steps of countries who have seen significant collapses in their economies and in living standards and in civil liberties. So of course that can happen in South Africa. It's never been impossible. It's always been the case. Is there hope? The last refuge of the desperate man. Of course there's hope. We should do one of these again. David is one of my colleagues here, and Bheki, on perhaps do the reasons for hope one. We run scenarios in which we are able to show how either through internal action, although we think the odds on this are low, or through the ballot box and a significant political realignment that will take place this decade, South Africa by the end of this decade can be firmly back on track to becoming the country that it's always had the potential to be, and the country that it was in many respects becoming in that first decade after 1994. So yes, absolutely there's hope. And you know, that comes from us. We're not the good news guys. We're the hawks. And we're hard-nosed, and we have introduce healthy dose of skepticism into what we hear from politicians. We don't tell you there's hope because we think we should. We tell it to you because it's real. That's the question now of how processes play out in time, and should no moves be taken in favor of structural reform, and with those no moves to stamp out corruption. One of the outcomes we show to clients now is a political realignment in the middle of this decade, South Africa taking a step to the center right towards the end of the decade, and an absolutely booming 2030s and 2040s. And if you haven't seen that analysis yet or read it, be in touch with us, and I'd actually enjoy showing it to you. Bheki.
Yeah, just to comment on the immigration part of Rich's question, this month's macro review is wholly focused on immigration trends here in South Africa, and as well as the skills leaving the country. Our next question comes from Eve France. Even if not all crooks can be jailed, would it not send a strong message and hopefully put future crooks off to start throwing them into prison, even if they start with low-level criminal offenders? And it would also send a positive message to international investors.
It would indeed. Eve is quite right. Would do exactly that. You see, we're not suggesting that each criminal element, the corruption element, state capture suspect, individually prosecuted. The scale of it, as I've shown you, would overwhelm the system. Critical is to start the processes of corruption at quite a high level, because as that happens, it's unlikely that the chap in question is going to go quietly. He'll feel singled out, he'll feel hard done by, he'll feel his colleagues might have done worse. And so the first prosecutions bring out more of the rot that eventually collapses the house of cards. And this is a political fear in the ANC, that if we start this, does it get a life and momentum of its own? So we flirt around the edges with some low-level officials who are politically deemed expendable because they perhaps don't have a great degree of knowledge or insight about the malfeasance of their peers. But Eve, prosecute one or two big fish with proper knowledge and understanding of what has happened across the board over the past decade, and you could set in motion a chain of events that would begin to clean the system out virtually on its own. Bheki.
Our next question comes from Emily. What do you think about prospects for local and provincial direct elections? What would that improve things, as local voters could demand greater accountability and directly vote out corrupt officials rather than waiting for the central party to investigate, punish, or suspend them?
I think I'm in two minds. I think our electoral system is working. And I think what I can see and read in the trends of the past decade is that if you govern South Africa badly, and if people's lives do not improve, you pay a very great political price for that. Now, of course, this takes time, but ANC support is in practice far weaker than the 57% suggested in last year's election. There are more people who don't vote than the number of people who vote for the ANC. For example, people who are entitled to vote who don't vote, than those who vote for the ANC. So the system, I think, is working, and hence why so often when a client asks us to explain to them the chess moves from here on out through the decade, one of the moves we see is checkmate and a change of government. The ANC loses its national majority. So you could say the system's adequate, the system's working, it takes time, it's a frustration, but politically this idea that the ANC pays no price for corruption, electorally, complete nonsense. Data's unambiguous that that's not the case. So I think the system works. Would the system work better if you had direct elections? It probably would. If you could have direct elections in two respects. You can split parliament into an upper and a lower house. The one elected on the current basis and the second elected on the basis of constituencies. And any piece of policy or legislation needs to be passed through both houses. So where you reside, there'd be a member of parliament. And when the vote came on Mr. Zuma, you could call your member of parliament back to his constituency, her constituency, and say, did you vote against Mr. Zuma or for him? And on the basis of that, you could decide whether you wanted to retain your member of parliament or not. Second way would be direct presidential elections, with primaries, etc. I think both have great merit, and if they were pursued, I think they would definitely improve the degree of political accountability in our country. But will they be approved? The ANC would, most factions would oppose. There is a faction in the ANC that's actually quite keen on this, even within the ANC itself. They think it clean the party up, and I think they're right. The Democratic Alliance, don't know where they stand today, but a year ago they would have opposed this because it breaks the power of party bosses to dictate the goings on within parties, which can be quite useful sometimes. I think it would improve matters. Politically, I don't see the way through to see it happen now. And I don't think that should distress one too much, because I do believe that the current political system is working. And if South Africa is too slowly, but working, if South Africa remains a free society, I think it's eventually through the ballot box that many of our problems will have to be addressed, should the current political leadership fail to address them while they are still in power. Bheki, back to you.
Thank you, Frans. Just a clarification, the immigration trend macro review will be on next month's macro review. This month's macro review will be on corruption. Our next question comes from Walter. What is your view on a constitutional amendment to the effect that the president may not be a president or member of the top leadership of his or her party, practically within 3 months of being sworn in? Such a president would need to resign his or her party post. Same could be extended to cabinet members.
Never had the question before. I'm not sure what I think. Off the bat, in practice, could you still exert influence from, I don't see it practically working. I'm a bit caught flat-footed because it's a unique question. I've never had it before. I'm going to pass on it, Bheki, because I don't actually know how to answer it. But perhaps the chaps will think a bit and in one of our notes or so pop out an answer in due course. Bheki.
Yeah, if there's any more questions that anyone would like to ask us, you can simply send Sherwin an email and then simply pass it to any of us and we'll answer it accordingly. Frans, that's all the questions that's been posted on the Q&A function as well as the chat function. Is there any, would anyone like me to unmute them if they'd like to ask any final questions?
If there is nothing else, Bheki,
yeah, there's nothing else.
I'd thank everyone who was here for attending. If you're not a regular user of ours, be in contact and we'll change that. But to my own colleagues, thank you for your work on this, especially Bheki, who wrote and did and produced this briefing for me up until the last minute. Bheki, thank you for that. And Bheki, I leave it to you to say goodbye from me for this afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Frans. Just a reminder, you will receive again the slides and enjoy your day. If there's anything else you'd like to ask us, send an email to Sherwin and Sherwin will send it to me or anyone who's available to us and we'll answer your questions.